Professor Thomas Farr. His book is World of Faith and Freedom: Why International Religious Liberty is Vital to American National Security. Professor Farr, why is it vital?
For two reasons. One is that religious freedom is a fundamental human right. Most people would accept that proposition. And it's under siege around the world. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life recently published a study, comprehensive study, in which they said 70% of the world's population lives in countries in which religious freedom is severely restricted. That's almost 3 out of 4 people on the planet. And what's associated with this is a lot of violent religious persecution, torture, rape, unjust imprisonment, unjust execution. So it's a humanitarian crisis, and the United States has traditionally stood with the persecuted. But it's also a strategic crisis, because the data show, and I would argue both history and common sense confirm it, that without religious freedom you cannot, particularly in a highly religious society, have a stable democracy. So when you think of all these countries of the Arab Spring, all of them highly religious societies, or countries where we've invested enormous amounts of blood and treasure, Afghanistan, Iraq, or take Pakistan, or other countries that are struggling to have a stable democracy. It's in our interest for them to succeed. But they can't succeed if they don't get this religion-state issue right, if they don't get religious freedom right. In addition, I would say that the data show that when religious freedom is absent, you have religion-related violence, extremism, terrorism. And that is a major issue for the United States because it's reached our shores, it affects our military deployments, it affects what we do all over the world. So this is, on the one hand, a humanitarian issue, on the other, a vital national interest.
So what has been the traditional or historic role of religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy?
Historically, it has played a muted role as part of our human rights policy. And we've always stood for human rights, sometimes more rhetorically than in terms of our actual foreign policy, but that's okay. I mean, we have interests as a country, as every country does, and human rights, while important to us, can't always be at the top. During the Soviet period, you know, we were very concerned about human rights, but we were also concerned about those missiles. What I'm arguing is that this remains true with religious freedom, but it has taken on a sharpened salience because the world is very religious. Whether you and I like it or not, it's irrelevant. Whether American diplomats like it or not, more to the point, is irrelevant. It is religious. And our job as American diplomats is to engage the world in defense of American interests. So to answer your question, it historically has played a rhetorical role in our foreign policy. There's nothing wrong with rhetoric. There's nothing wrong with, in fact, sometimes it's good. Ideas have consequences. Speeches, particularly presidential speeches, and speeches by secretaries of state, are important. But they have to be followed by policies. And my argument in this book is that we aren't doing enough in terms of concrete strategic planning, policy development, program development, actually to advance religious freedom on the ground. We've got a lot of words. Some of them are very fine words. We don't have enough action.
Why did you specifically refer to the American Diplomatic Corps?
Well, I spent 21 years as an American diplomat, and I got into this issue in the 1990s when Congress passed a law called the International Religious Freedom Act. And I was, at the time, an American diplomat doing the things that American diplomats do. My specialty during the 80s was the Cold War. I negotiated with the Soviets. I served in Geneva. I worked on Greece, Turkey, Cyprus issues. And then this law was passed in the late 90s. It created an Office of International Religious Freedom in the State Department. And it said the United States will now formally advance religious freedom around the world. So I was privileged to be asked by the first head of that office, called an ambassador at large for religious freedom, to come in and be the director, sort of the chief of staff. And this is how I got involved in this issue. I did it for 4 years. I served under 2 ambassadors at large. I concluded it was important for our country, and we were not doing a very good job. We weren't taking it seriously enough. So I wrote this book, and the American diplomatic corps is really quite good, but it has been trained, I would argue, in American universities, most of them elite universities, but also in their foreign service training. Traditionally, religion is not something really to get involved in. It's almost like your mother told you, you know, don't talk about religion at the dinner table. Well, keep it off the policy table. A good example of this is Henry Kissinger, who is sort of the quintessential American Foreign Service officer and diplomat. He wrote, he's a remarkable man, he's still writing, but in 1994 he wrote his opus, Diplomacy, it was modestly called, and it was a tour of the entire modern history of diplomacy in the Western world. 1,000 pages, an index of 135, 40 pages. The word religion does not appear in the index. It's as if after the wars of religion of the 17th century, it simply disappeared as a relevant matter. And even during the period when Henry Kissinger himself was Secretary of State, he was the National Security Advisor of the President, when John Paul II was transforming, along with Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher, what was going on in the Soviet Union, when Ayatollah Khomeini was on the rise in Iran, it's as if none of this had anything to do with religion, and religion had nothing to do with international affairs. Now, that's not a criticism of Kissinger per se. And it isn't animus, as far as I know, on his part toward religion. It's simply a sort of a default position that's just not relevant. It's private. After 9/11, I think we can no longer conclude that religion is something we shouldn't be engaging on in our diplomatic policies.
Thomas Farr, when we do emphasize religious freedom, is it Christian-centric?
Yeah, that's a good question. The perception is, the answer is yes. The perception out there in the Muslim world, the perception among some here in the United States, is absolutely not true. You know, all you got to do is read the law, that is the blueprint for this. It doesn't mention any religion, much less Christianity. The notion is to advance religious freedom for all people. But of course, there are people, this is a highly volatile subject, religion. Everybody has strong feelings about it. And Christianity is a proselytizing religion. The issue of proselytization is one that you have to grapple with if you're going to talk about religious freedom, let alone promote it. But no, the idea here is not to make the world safe for Christian missionaries. It is to focus on religious liberty as a constituent element of human dignity and of societies and politics. It really is something that can be talked about and implemented irrespective of what the religious demography is. Now, the reality is that Christians around the world as minorities are in big trouble. They are fleeing Iraq. They're fleeing many of the countries of the Middle East. What happens to the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt has a great deal to do with the future of that country. So it isn't that Christians are irrelevant or Christianity is irrelevant, but the notion of religious freedom is not about Christians. Now, historically, if we want to talk about where did this notion come from, you know, Christianity and the Jewish understanding of God and man and so forth plays a role. But Islam, there are a number of Muslim scholars at work today who argue that religious freedom is required by Islam, not only consistent with it, but required by it. Unfortunately, in my view, these brave men and women are not in the ascendant in much of the Muslim world. If they were, we'd have far fewer problems on this issue. So no, it's not just about Christians. It's about it's about human beings.
What are some of the problems and national security problems that we may face in looking at the two largest countries in the world, China and India?
That's an excellent question because it helps me make the point that this is not simply a problem of the Muslim majority world. Both of these countries have tremendous problems with religious liberty. Let me begin first with India, which, as most people know, is a Hindu majority nation, but it also has a huge Muslim minority. So what happens to the issue of religion and state in that country is of great importance, not only for India, which is huge and growing and of enormous economic importance to the United States and its neighbors. It's also a nuclear weapons country next to a Muslim majority country, Pakistan, which also has nuclear weapons.